Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard. Houston, we have a coach. With that, welcome into a special breaking news episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Joined as always by my good friend, co-host and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. This is a special breaking news episode on Monday night, April 24th. Because we now know the Rockets, as mentioned off the very top, have their next head coach. It's Ime Udoka, formerly head coach of the Boston Celtics during the 2021-22 NBA season when he led Boston to the NBA Finals. So, Paolo, first things first, 30 seconds or less reaction. What did you think when you saw the Woj bomb that the Rockets search after just 2 weeks was over?
Bro, do you know who I am? How are you going to ask me for a 30-second reaction? It's impossible. That being said, I just wasted 5 seconds just saying that. I mean, just extremely happy. I think it's one of those situations where when you hear rumors that you're trading for a star for a while, or that you're in to trade for a star for a while, this feels like when you actually trade for them, because we heard the rumors around the big names, Nurse, Udoka, Atkinson, Vogel, but now this is actually capitalizing on it. This is the closure that we needed, that okay, we were in for those names, now we actually nailed one of those names, the guy that I had second on my list. So I don't think you can look at this in any other way other than this is a massive bit of good news, and this is the first step for Rafael Stone this offseason. Completely nailed, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll pick back the more Udoka-specific angles when we have a podcast later in the week, because the Rockets are going to introduce him to the media. We don't have a set time, but I expect that to happen within the next few days. At that point, of course, he'll talk about not only his vision for the Rockets on the court. We know it's an important offseason, but Ime Udoka is also going to have to answer for the elephant in the room, the baggage, why he's not currently with the Celtics, despite having so much success in his one season there. And of course, that's the scandal, allegedly the inappropriate relationship with a female subordinate that cost him his job. Other than one hastily issued statement the night that everything broke last September, he hasn't had to go on the record about it at all. He's perhaps wisely kept a low profile since, and he hasn't had to do any media since he wasn't officially coaching the Celtics or anyone else. Now he's going to have to address that. So we'll have longer comments in a few days when we hear so much perspective from Udoka in regarding certainly the team, but also his past. And Rafael Stone, as GM of the Rockets, will also have to talk about how the Rockets balanced all of those factors. And we know from Woj that the Rockets did do their due diligence with both the Celtics and the NBA league office in clearing Udoka before offering him the job. Again, we're not overlooking that today. We're just going to shelve that for a few days until we have more context. And that's going to come when both Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka meet with the media. What I think is important to underscore in the immediate aftermath of the Rockets reaching this agreement in principle is just how much it reflects how badly this team wants to win. Woj reported that Udoka had other options, including the Toronto Raptors. After we recorded our last episode on Thursday night with Justin Quinn, editor of Celtics Wire, breaking down Udoka's candidacy with the Rockets, we also talked about how that might prompt the Raptors to decide the fate of Nick Nurse, because it had been reported previously that Toronto might want Udoka. Well, the very next morning, they did fire Nick Nurse, and they were reported to really be in the Udoka market. And yet we know from Woj that Rafael Stone closed the deal in Houston. That speaks really well to him. It also speaks well to Tillman Fertitta because, spoiler, Ime Udoka is not coming cheaply with other options on the market, or he simply could have waited around the same way that Quinn Snyder did last offseason and have his pick of the jobs that open up mid-season. you had to give him a pretty big deal, an accomplished 45-year-old coach that's been to the NBA Finals and is so well regarded amongst players and really, I would say, the entire player circle around the league. Magic Johnson was among the many people I saw nationally talking about what a great hire this is. And you can tell that Udoka, as a former player, as someone that while he's just had 1 year as a head coach, he's had 9 years as an assistant with the Spurs, the Sixers, the Nets, including 7 with Greg Popovich, which gives him so much pedigree. It was not a cheap hire. It was not an easy hire. He had other options, and Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta got the job done. Now, is there risk to the hire? Certainly, but that's for another day. I don't see any point in going into this Ime Udoka era assuming that the other shoe is going to drop in regards to his past or a future incident. We can cross that bridge if and when we come to it. I think for now, the way to look at it is this is how badly the Rockets want to win. Yes, they are very serious. They get it. And quite frankly, the risk is the only reason why a coach like Ime Udoka is on the market in the first place. As I see it, it's not to downplay all those other angles. They're absolutely significant. And if those things come up again, then sure, we may be having a different discussion a few months or years from now, and it may speak poorly of Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta. But for now, based on what we know, and again, this would not have happened without working through his past with the Celtics and the league office, and I'm sure he's shown some remorse in the interview process, and there has been accountability with him missing a season. Look, I'm a believer that, especially after a year off, people deserve a fresh start. There's definitely been people that have come back to the NBA from worse, as Justin Quinn noted in our last pod. And so if all the other things happen, we can talk about them later. For now, I think the bigger takeaway is this shows just how serious the Houston Rockets are about winning. They're willing to take the risk. They're willing to take the requisite financial investment. This is an organization that really and truly cares. And I think that's a really important starting spot. I think a secondary point that I would raise is that going into a summer in which the Rockets have so much cap space, look, having a coach like Ime Udoka that is that respected on the market, that can only help their appeal to potential coaches. So, or to potential players, excuse me. So I think that's a little something that could potentially be a boost to the Rockets as well in a summer that's so important on a number of levels. Well, now you have a coach that really seems to resonate with players around the league. We've heard that while he's big on structure and accountability, he's a player's coach. We've heard how Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum have spoken about him. So that could be a slight boost as well. But it's not just about one-off season. When you make this type of hire and the money that comes with it, you're hoping to set yourself up for a generation of Rockets basketball. And I think, again, we'll get back to the X's and O's in a few days because it's tough to say exactly from his 1 year in Boston, what are his fundamental principles and what's basically him adapting his principles to the personnel the Celtics had at the time, which is obviously very different from a young Rockets team led by the likes of Jalen Green, Jabari Smith Jr., and Alperen Şengün. I think the bigger takeaway right now, you can celebrate. Look, the Rockets were not perfect last season. That's in large part why Stephen Silas is gone. But a lot of the critiques about their culture and the organization as a whole, to me, I think this shows pretty clearly that a lot of that stuff was overdone. Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta went out to the marketplace. They got a big deal done. No, you can't ultimately judge it as a success or failure until more time passes. But I think for right now, it shows you the lengths that they are willing to go. And as a Rockets fan, I think that's something that should give you a lot of optimism moving forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you said. Tillman Fertitta had given us some signs that he was changing compared to the version of him that the luxury tax back when we were contending. I'm sure in no small part because he's a lot richer now than it was back then. But I think it's I think it's really important that we saw he spent on first round picks. We saw he was on second round picks. I mean buying second round picks. We saw that even when the Rockets were one of the worst teams in the league and tanking, we were still we weren't like the Thunder who were below the salary floor, for example. We were actually had a pretty decent payroll. We were like within 5 million of the luxury tax even while rebuilding. And then we actually went through a rebuild, which is costly for the owners. I think a lot of people forget about this. Tanking is not good for getting people in the stadium and stuff like that.
Not at all.
And then now, this is the key point. This is the biggest inflection point for me. Because I said before, earlier in the season, when the rumors started circling about Rafael Stone and him meddling and about how much do the Rockets want to be good versus how much do the Rockets want or how much the Raphaels don't want to be the hero, for example. I think that was a narrative that was going on. I think this is a very hard step, and I said this so before. Whoever you get as a head coach after Stephen Silas will be really telling. And Ime Udoka is a player's coach. He is someone who is liked around the league by players. I mean, we just hear how the Celtics players still talk about him. He is someone who comes from the Greg Popovich tree of coaching, and most importantly, he strikes me as someone who, if Rafael Stone tries to meddle, who's going to stand up for himself, and he's going to say, "Hey, no, this is my job. I'm here to do this part. You can worry about the team." And going after someone with that type of personality to me is an indication from Rafael, from Patrick, from everybody else that, hey, now we're going to win. Now we're really serious about winning. And I think you touched on this as well. Ime Udoka was someone who was in for the Raptors job. He was the only big name guy that was in for the Pistons job. So the two other openings right now, and I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that the Mavs might need a head coach. I'm not sure how safe Jason Kidd is. If the Sixers don't win, I think they'll be an opening as well, and I think they'd be very willing to take Udoka. The fact that he didn't wait not only for the lottery but for the end of the playoffs, which is when or as teams fall out of the playoffs. I mean, only one series has ended this far, and it's the Nets, the one that everybody expected to end. He didn't wait for those head coaching options to open up. So it means that the Rockets must have made them. It was a combination of what we have in our how attractive our situation is and how much money was put on the table. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. I'm sure that Ime Udoka is being very well compensated for his work and for signing his deal this early. And then the other thing I want to touch on, other than that aspect of it, is, and this is kind of X's and nose, but it isn't really that in depth. Well, two things. First of all, I really think that James Borrego might be the lead assistant or associate head coach or whatever it is. Even
there is a tie from their San Antonio days, yes.
Exactly, and if you pay close attention, and you go to Woj's report, the written version of it, right? Not the tweet, the one actually on the ESPN page. He mentions James Borrego as someone who was very liked within the interview process, which makes me think with those ties that he might be the guy that they bring in as the lead head coach, as the guy that's there in case something happens with Udoka, and knock on wood, hopefully it doesn't. That's a guy that can take on the role of head coach in a pinch if need be for the rest of the season, like Mazzulla did with the Celtics when Udoka eventually had to be suspended, right? So knowing that and reading the once again referencing the piece by Kelly Iko of The Athletic about James Borrego and how he used like a dribble handoff based offense and everything, and how even Udoka used Al Horford with the Celtics. We know it's a really small sample size, but I think that combo of offense versus defense with Udoka as the head coach, so it's even more defensively oriented, bodes well for Sengun. And I think a lot of people were scared because we were going after defensive-minded head coaches that Sengun might struggle. Let's look at the best case scenario, and you can plug in, and let's say we get Wemby, for example. But I think if you don't get Wemby, you can plug in J.R. Smith to some extent into this role. The Celtics ran Rob Will and Al Horford as their tandem in the front court. I think if Sengun is to be successful in this league as a defensive player, Al Horford's a pretty good model to follow as someone who doesn't have the craziest athletic tools, but is really smart about how he plays defense and uses his body really well to close angles and to play that balance between contesting a jump shot and not getting blown by. I think Sengun should be watching a lot of Al Horford footage, and I think Udoka, we know he is a coach that's going to adapt to the players that he has, and I think the same thing might work here. With Wemby being the Rob Will, the free safety type of defensive presence, it's going to make up for Al Horford's lack of athleticism and lack of actual rim protection, especially at this stage in his career. And so that combo, I think, could be really good. If we don't get Wemby, I think you could do similar stuff, either if you bring in a rim running big, or if you just try to use J.R. Smith in that role. I think it's good for Sengun. I think that combo would be good for Sengun because on the offensive end, Borrego is someone who can use a guy like Sengun, and Udoka himself used Al Horford in a lot of those same situations the year that he did coach. So I think as someone who isn't as high on Sengun as others, I think this is the best case scenario for him and for him to be successful in Houston. And I would, if you asked me before, I would have guessed that Sengun might be traded this offseason. Now I'm not so sure. I think he might be one of his favorite players. And I also think that this might mean something towards the point guard search. The Celtics did need a point guard, but Udoka did make the offense work with guys that are not primary playmakers. That are both wings in Tatum and Jalen Brown. And the Rockets have Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. who can do not do a lot of the same stuff because they're not as good, but fit a lot of the same archetypes and plays ran for them. So just from a little bit of an X's and O's perspective, I really like the hire in that sense as well. And the last thing I'll talk about is, above everything, I said this on the last podcast, we need a defense, and we need someone that's going to hold these guys accountable and inspire them to be the best versions of themselves and to try on the defensive end. I think Udoka, out of all the guys available, is the best at it. I think Nick Nurse is has a little bit more of a grading personality, so he would likely be more aggressive in his approach. I think Udoka it's more of a professional, more of a reach, have a way to reach those guys in a more empathic type of way. I think that's the word. I'm not sure. Whatever. So I really liked it from that perspective. And last thing I'll point out, it's interesting for KPJ, this one, because out of the head coaches available, if there was one that you could convince me that might be able to convince KPJ to commit to a sixth man role off the bench, if James Harden comes in especially, I think Udoka is the guy to reach through him. I think Nurse would have been more of a no bullshit approach, and I'm not sure Nurse would be able to, not Nurse, Vogel would be able to get that done at all. And I think Udoka has a chance. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but as someone who is a fan of KPJ and thinks that he would really, be successful in that role, I really like the side as well. So I think, listen, just a big, even though Nurse was my number one option, Udoka was solidly my number two, and to me, it's still a home run hire. And my final takeaway is step one's done. They nailed it this offseason so far. For step one, to me, is an A plus. Now, and this was one of the really big blockbuster steps, really important. You still got the draft, you got free agency, and we got trades. It's a 4-step program. Step one was aced. Let's see how the next ones go.
As far as Sengun, I'll just point to our archives. I thought that was one important piece that distinguished the Frank Vogel pod we had with Caitlin Cooper versus the Udoka pod with Justin Quinn. Justin was pretty optimistic about the fit of Sengun with Ime Udoka, whereas Caitlin was not that optimistic about how Sengun might fit, especially defensively, with what Frank Vogel wants to do. Look, for me, as I break down who I believe were truly the top three, and regardless of whether Nurse got a true interview or not, I suspect it'll come out about whether he was able to get an interview in on Saturday or Sunday. If he didn't, I honestly don't think that you can blame the Rockets. This search only lasted 2 weeks, and that's with good reason. When you're getting a top candidate, you can't wait around because there's all sorts of things that can happen to change the market. Other jobs might come open after this first round of the NBA playoffs. The Rockets move quickly because unlike the search in 2020, which lasted 6 weeks and they clearly didn't get their top targets going in, the big names were listening this time. And so you don't want to wait around on a maybe if you can close a deal now and start your momentum heading into a very important summer, both internally with development and, of course, also your appeal to the offseason market, trades, free agency, and what have you. As far as who I believe to be the top three, which were Frank Vogel, Ime Udoka, and Nick Nurse. I know Kenny Atkinson was rumored as well, but for reasons we've discussed in prior pods, I just don't think Atkinson got that close of a look based on his offensive background. I also don't know how much he just wanted the job, quite frankly. There is some questions about that. Does he really want to be a head coach? Because we know he had the Charlotte job last offseason, backed out, and know he's pretty happy being the lead assistant in Golden State to Steve Kerr, and who can blame him? That's a really good situation and a great team. So if he just wants to have that lifestyle, you can't really blame him. But regardless, even if he did want the job, I think the odds were always in favor of the Rockets looking a different direction stylistically than Stephen Silas. Jonathan Fagan has talked about it as the rule of opposites before. And with Silas having an offensive background from his days in Dallas, I do think that's something that hurt Kenny Atkinson a bit. He also hasn't coached at the highest level. His head coaching experience came with the Brooklyn Nets when they were in a rebuild. So he hasn't coached at the highest level in terms of getting to or winning the NBA Finals the way that Vogel, Nurse, and Udoka have. And he also comes from more of an offensive background. I think for a lot of reasons, a coach that's more defensive minded, that has a bit more proven chops when it comes to structure, accountability, discipline. I think those were things that appeal to the Rockets. And so I think the combination of those factors with the proven high level experience in a head coaching role of guys like Vogel, Udoka, and Nurse was really attractive to the Rockets. And because Tillman Fertitta is willing to spend, they were in the door for all of those guys, especially once Toronto moved Nick Nurse out the door so that they could try to get Ime Udoka. Fortunately, that did not work out. To me, the reason I think they ended up going with Udoka, I think he's the best blend. I think the way to look at those three guys, they sort of have a unique place along the same chain. Frank Vogel is someone who's fairly even keeled in that he has a system. There's a way that he typically coaches, especially on the defensive end of the floor. He's fairly patient. That doesn't mean that he's not going to hold guys accountable, that he's not respected. From everything I know, he is. But at the same time, he's not someone that's a huge screamer, yeller. He's just very, I guess, Frank Vogel. That's the way I would put it. He's a brand name after 10 years. There's a certain way that he does things, very calm, composed, measured. He lays out the expectations. And if you don't meet them, then he'll look to his bench and they'll look externally for other options. With Nick Nurse, I think his coaching acumen goes without saying, but I do wonder if he was the best fit for a Rockets team that, regardless of what they do this offseason, is still going to be extraordinarily young in a lot of places within the rotation with regards to Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr., Tari Eason, and so on and so forth. Nick Nurse's style can be so intense that I do think it's why he had worn out his welcome with the Raptors after 5 years as head coach. And even with a veteran laden team, there were reports throughout the year that there was perhaps some baggage and things happening behind the scenes in Toronto that not everyone was aware of. I wonder, number one, how that would translate to an extraordinarily young roster like the one the Rockets have. And two, if there is something of a wearing out effect with regards to Nick Nurse and his intensity, making it difficult for him to last in a spot for a very long time, then what does that mean for a situation like the Rockets where your contending window doesn't really open for probably 3 or 4 years? Are you going to be needing to make another coaching change right when you're trying to actually win the NBA title? I think with Vogel, again, I don't want to say that he's just mellow, but I think he's, while certainly can be intense, he's a bit closer to Mike D'Antoni in that you're not going to see him go out of his way to throw a tantrum on a regular basis. Nick Nurse is at the other end of that spectrum. I think Ime Udoka is somewhere in between in that there are Vogel elements to, I suppose, a certain level of stoic professionalism, but there's also an ability to get intense and get in people's faces when needed. It just didn't seem to rise to the level that it did with Nurse and the Raptors. And that's where I wonder, for an extraordinarily young roster like this, if there's a shelf life on the coaching of Nick Nurse, does that make sense for a team that is still in something of a rebuild? Maybe you take Nick Nurse if you're in a situation where all that matters is the next 3 or 4 years. And even if he wears out his welcome and is grating on the locker room, whatever, hopefully you win a title because you maximize those parts the way that Toronto did in 2019 with Nick Nurse, and then nothing else matters. But I think in this situation, it sort of needs to be a blend of a lot of different factors. And so I think Udoka, the fact that he does have intensity, but according to all reports, was still able to bond with his players in Boston. And to this day, even after the scandal, we talked about that in our last episode, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they stood by him and talked about how huge he was for their development and the growth of that team coming off a 500 year the year before and then going to the NBA Finals. I think that might be the optimal blend for this situation with where the Rockets are. So I just think that Vogel honestly might have been the perfect coach in 2020 for the Rockets, in that going into a rebuild, him setting clear standards and consistently getting guys to play hard and to buy into a defined role. That might have been the ideal hire if you were going this route amongst the three defensive coaches at the very start of the rebuild in 2020 or 2021. Nick Nurse might have been the ideal hire if you were right on the precipice of contending for a title, and all that mattered was maximizing every last drop out of the next 3 or 4 years, if this was 2025 or 2026. But in this sort of in between period in 2023, Udoka might be a blend of those two, Vogel and Nurse, that is. And so that's my thought as to why the Rockets went in this direction.
Yeah, and just to close out, I think to add to what you said about Nurse versus Udoka, I think Udoka is someone, at least from what we see, the relationships he has with the Celtics players. I think he's someone who can bond and become like actual friends with the players, but also be able to keep that distance and remain professional. I think nowadays, with superstars just being able to demand trades whenever they want to, the way you get the players you draft to stay is by having them, fall in love with the city, fall in love with the franchise, and like, think positively of their time with the team. This is not anywhere close to our situation right now because they're on rookie deals, and for this the foreseeable future they're all going to be in Houston unless we trade them. But having a guy like Nurse early on in their careers might sour a little bit of the experience they have with our team. And I know this is, a little being like coddling the players a little bit, but it is true. It is more ideal to have someone who's going to demand respect, but also relate to people, rather than someone who's going to demand the respect, but also be grading at the same time. And so I think long term, when Jalen Green's 28 and he's going out of his first max deal, because I know he's going to get it because I really believe in him. At that point, I think these 3-4 years that we're going to go through now are going to play a big role in him. If we go through some trouble like the Mavs are right now with Kyrie and Luka Doncic, and hopefully this doesn't happen to us, but if we go through something like that, or we're not the favorites, but we're on that second tier of contention, I think having the players, be happy throughout these years, these formative years of their careers, is important, because I think the only true way that you can get guys to stay long term is by making them like their time here. That's why Damian Lillard that stayed for so long in the team that with the Portland Trail Blazers. That's how you get guys to be franchise guys long term. And so I think Udoka fits in that regard. I think something we haven't mentioned yet, in specific about the holding players accountable. I look forward to, and maybe I'll be pissed at the time, but I look forward to if Jalen Green is giving the effort that he was earlier in the season that was terrible. I look forward to seeing Ime Udoka bench him, because I think a lot of people think, oh, you actually don't want one of these defensive coaches that are going to hold players accountable because they're going to bench your guys. Hey, listen, if anybody is not putting up the effort, which is the minimum required, then they deserve to be benched. And I think when these guys put in the effort, they are good enough they won't be benched because of their lack of ability. And unless, I mean, it might happen in some scenarios, but I think in most scenarios it won't. So I'm really looking forward to that with Jalen, with KPJ, with Sengun, with whatever players. I don't think it will ever happen with Tyrese or Jabari because those guys try hard. But I think that will be really important. And the last thing that I'll mention is that I think back in 2020, when the Rockets drafted Sengun, there was an article that came out on Celtics Wire from USA Today. You can plug it in. You can plug it right now if you want to. Was while Udoka was head coach there. The Celtics had their eyes on Sengun and explored trading up to get him back then to pair him up with Robert Williams. And I think this is also before Al Horford was there. This is before the OKC trade, if I'm not mistaken. I might be getting my timelines confused. But it's interesting that they found a player like Sengun interesting enough to pair up with Robert Williams, right? And perhaps run a similar scheme to what they did with Al Horford. So just a little extra tiny bit about perhaps this being a good hire for Sengun.
The last thing I'll say before we wrap up, again, I'm not trying to overlook the role of his baggage. Udoka, that is. I just think, number one, we'll hear more about it at the press conference. Yes, it's going to be brought up. Yes, he's going to be asked about it for the first time since it happened all those months ago. It is going to be a topic of discussion. We're going to learn more about it. But then, regardless of what he says, and spoiler alert, he's going to show remorse. If he didn't, they wouldn't have offered him the job. Clearly, he responded appropriately during the interview process. Clearly, the recommendations from others around the league and the due diligence they did with the Celtics and the league office came back fairly positively. If it didn't, the Rockets wouldn't be here. They have common sense. I can assure you of that. Ultimately, with regards to his past, it is a risk. And even if he says all the right things, we will get into it once the press conference happens, and we'll have reaction right here at the logger line. But I just think in general, as far as what it means for the Rockets, it's one of those situations that time will tell. You're going to have to let it play out and see if he's truly learned from the mistakes he made in Boston. It's something that, regardless of what he says or doesn't say right now, it honestly doesn't matter. Time will tell. And I just don't see the point in going into this process assuming the worst. I think you give him a chance. You acknowledge that there's risk going into it, just as, let's be honest, there's risk with any hire. There's no perfect hire. There's a reason these guys are on the market, be it for basketball reasons or otherwise. This is just one of many risks. The bottom line is the Rockets really want to win. There are clear basketball reasons to make this hire. And as for the rest, you hope your due diligence turns out to be accurate. You hope your background on him pans out, and you trust him to do the right things in the future. And if he doesn't, then you deal with that when it comes. And should that be the case, would it be a black mark for Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta at that time? Sure. Again, they are taking a risk, but I can respect the risk because it shows you just how much they truly do care about winning. And so for today, I just don't see the point in assuming the worst. I'm going to go into it with an open mind, and hopefully Ime Udoka proves worthy of them taking this leap of faith. That's all I know to say about it right now.
Yeah, just one last thing about what you just said. I think it's important to not go too far either direction. I think it's important to not completely brush it off because you can do that. But I also think it's important to not go all the way, the opposite end, because we heard so little about it that it leaves space for both, for people to completely disregard it and people who blow it out of proportion and say that he raped someone. We don't know if he did. I'd hope that he didn't, otherwise he should be in jail. But you can't go too far either direction without knowing too much, and I doubt that we'll know too much because it's hard to talk about it without mentioning who the other half of the problem was, and I'm sure
Sure.
that whoever it is doesn't want to talk about it, so whatever we get won't be much. But I think it's important to not go too far both ways. And something that I had to debate within myself throughout my life. I mean, this is a completely different experience, which is, the Cristiano Ronaldo rape case, which has a lot more evidence than whatever went on with Udoka. And I mean, I'm Portuguese, for those who don't know. Ronaldo would still represent the national team. And so eventually, I'm not going to stop rooting for my country, right? It's a big part of sports culture here. So eventually, I had to learn to kind of separate who Cristiano Ronaldo is the person from who Cristiano Ronaldo is the athlete. And I think with Udoka, it's sort of something like that where, hey, I can respect him and root for him on the court like I do for Ronaldo on the pitch. But when we get off the pitch, and this will obviously depend on what comes out about Udoka, with Ronaldo, I know he's a complete idiot, right? And I don't like him the person, but hey, on a sports field, right? I'm not going to stop rooting for my national team about it, right? So it's possible to separate the person from the professional, and depending on what eventually comes out with Udoka, that might be what I have to do as well, and it wouldn't be the first time that I do it.
Yeah. I think that's a fair perspective. Look, this is a game. This is sports at the highest level. This is not some church league. These are not perfect people. Ime Udoka is not the only person in the NBA that has made a mistake. And to the extent that we know of this situation, the alleged affair with a female subordinate, the inappropriate workplace relationship with uncomfortable power dynamics, according to the reporting that's out there, there's definitely situations that have been worse in which players and coaches have proceeded with their careers afterward. Am I using that as an excuse? No, I'm just referencing it as context. This is not a league where you're trying to build the perfect roster from a character perspective. There's baggage in the past of Kevin Porter Jr. as one example with the Rockets. That's part of why they got him at such a cheap rate from Cleveland. You don't want to go out and get bad people, no, but there is a blend of, I suppose, the character concerns with maximizing your odds of winning basketball games. This is sports at the highest level. And while there are some lines that you should never cross, and I won't disrespect anyone that feels this is a line they can't get past, I'm personally not there based on what we know. And as we've discussed in previous pods, I'm not comfortable going beyond that line based on various tweets and supposition that's out there. You can feel however you want to feel, but for me, understanding the context of professional sports, it's not something that I can't get past. I understand why they're taking this risk. In many ways, it's analogous to risks that they've already taken and that other teams are taking around the league. These are not perfect people. It's a blend of trying to maximize character concerns with putting together the best product on the basketball floor and maximize your odds of winning a championship. And ultimately, this is a risk they felt they needed to take. And so I'm going to go into it with an open mind. If it doesn't work out, then sure, it's a black mark on the guys who, as it turned out, would have somewhat misjudged his character or perhaps not weighted his past properly. It is a risk, but I understand why they're taking that risk, and I go into it with an open mind.
Yeah, and just to close it out, from what I said earlier about Ronaldo and my example, listen, I don't want anyone to come away from this saying that I'm trying to tell you how to feel. No, any any side that you end up taking, if this makes you not able to root for the Rockets, then you're well within your right, right? Everybody
Sure.
will process these things differently. Nobody's trying to tell you how to feel one way or the other, right? I was just providing, my experience from
Yep.
and what I eventually settled at. What you do is a completely different thing, and I don't think this is not a basketball thing, right? This is a moral stake. Not even I think this is a moral thing, and so everybody's entitled to feel whatever way they want
Yep.
to feel. So and don't let anybody tell you that you should feel a certain way about anything
Yep.
relating to stuff like this.
Well said. All right, this is where we will wrap it for today. Again, we will come back to that angle and also the X's and O's a bit more after the press conference. There's some things that we can wait for more context before diving into. And so we will have a second episode later this week once we hear from Udoka, once we hear from Rafael Stone, talking about those angles and going a bit more in depth about the potential fit of Ime Udoka with the Houston Rockets, because of course, in depth is what we do here at the Logger Line. We're just bringing you this shorter one on Monday night because look, it is breaking news and it is a big day in Houston Rockets history. I think it's only the 16th head coach in the history of the franchise. So yeah, let's talk about it. And these are our initial thoughts, and I do think there's reason for measured optimism at this moment with regards to the Ime Udoka hire and what it says about the Rockets moving forward, certainly the rest of this offseason, but also what's going to happen the next few years on the court, starting with this September when they report to training camp. Anyway, with that, we will bring this to a close. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. If you want more content from us before the next episode, the best place to get it is on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. And this show is on there at The Logger Line. That's where, if you go to our bio, you can find our link tree and get the links to all of our partners and sponsors, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire. You can access all of their content simply by going to our link tree and checking out what they have available. Thanks again to Carbach, Sports Talk 790, and Rockets Wire for their continued support. With those plugs complete, we'll wrap up. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line. Happy Ime Udoka Day, guys.